It was the kind of jaw-dropping moment that left even the most seasoned royal watchers stunned. An incident at a quiet English airport that would quickly explode into an international scandal. Before we get into the full story, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the inside details the palace would rather keep under wraps. What happened on that fateful morning was more than just a travel delay, more than just a mix-up with luggage. This was about trust, secrets, and a shocking confrontation that pitted one royal figure directly against another. It all began with a seemingly ordinary departure, but what security discovered inside a single piece of luggage changed the conversation about the royal family forever. The scene was set at Farnborough Airport, a location often used for discreet private travel. In the early hours of the morning, Queen Camilla was preparing to board a flight bound for Geneva. Her team was calm, her departure seemed uneventful, until one sharp-eyed security officer noticed something unusual about a particular trunk. Unlike the rest of the luggage, this piece carried a mark no ordinary traveller would ever possess, the royal crest of the late Queen Elizabeth II. It wasn't just a decoration, it was a seal of ownership, a sign that the trunk had once belonged to the most revered monarch in modern memory. Immediately, questions swirled. Why was this object here? Why was it leaving the country? And why was it in Camilla's possession at all? To understand the gravity of this discovery, you have to appreciate what that crest represents. For decades, Elizabeth's belongings were carefully catalogued, protected, and in some cases locked away in vaults and archives. After her passing, the fate of many personal items became the subject of delicate management within the family. A trunk marked with her seal would not be an ordinary suitcase. It would be a container potentially holding heirlooms, private documents, or artefacts tied directly to her legacy. The moment the guard raised his hand to stop the luggage, the entire situation shifted from routine procedure to something much more explosive. This wasn't simply about airline security. It was about whether one of the most respected legacies in history was being compromised in the dead of night. The airport staff were not in an easy position. On one side stood the Queen Consort, poised for departure, undoubtedly expecting her luggage to pass through without issue. On the other side was the unmistakable symbol of Elizabeth's seal, practically demanding that further inspection be carried out. The decision to halt the luggage was not taken lightly. The guard, aware of the consequences of interfering with a royal's travel, still made the call. That single act, raising his hand to pause the trunk, set off a chain reaction that would ripple from Farnborough to Buckingham Palace, and eventually across the entire world. What truly turned this from a quiet stop into an international story was what happened next. Rumours began almost instantly, whispered among airport staff and within palace circles, about the possibility of smuggling. The word itself is loaded, conjuring images of secretive transfers, hidden treasures and deliberate concealment. Was this trunk a vessel for Elizabeth's lost jewels? Were private letters being whisked away under vague paperwork? The manifest was unhelpful, described in terms so vague it could have applied to nearly anything. A generic entry, a destination outside the country, and an object carrying Elizabeth's crest. Together, these details painted a picture of something being moved without transparency, something that should never have been in that luggage line in the first place. And so, in the dawn light of that airport runway, suspicion began to spread like wildfire. Staff who witnessed the moment would later recall how tense the atmosphere became, how silence seemed to fall as eyes turned toward Camilla, waiting to see how she would respond. The mere presence of that trunk in her possession invited a flood of questions. Why was it headed to Geneva? Who had packed it? What exactly was inside? At that point, nobody had answers, but everyone knew that whatever was revealed next would either calm the storm or unleash one far worse. The symbolism of the situation cannot be overstated. This wasn't just a matter of luggage being stopped. It was about the perception that something sacred, something belonging to Elizabeth herself, was being quietly removed from the country without proper acknowledgement. It struck a nerve with the public, because Elizabeth had come to embody continuity, stability, and stewardship of the crown's treasures. To see her mark on a trunk intercepted in such a suspicious manner instantly raised the question of whether her legacy was being mishandled, or worse, deliberately concealed. At that exact moment, the balance of trust began to tilt. For years, Camilla had worked to build her image within the public eye, to transition from a figure of controversy into one of quiet support beside Charles. But in the face of a trunk carrying Elizabeth's seal, those years of careful repositioning seemed fragile. It was as if all the doubts people once held about her suddenly found a physical symbol, locked inside the iron corners of an antique trunk halted at an airport checkpoint. The fallout from this moment did not happen slowly. Even before the trunk was opened, word had begun to spread. Security chatter found its way into palace channels, and within hours, the news reached members of the family themselves. Among them, one person in particular took decisive action, Princess Anne. Known for her uncompromising sense of duty and unflinching directness, she did not wait for the matter to be resolved quietly behind closed doors. Instead, she made her way directly to Farnborough, intent on ensuring the trunk did not leave British soil without answers. That move, Anne's intervention, would prove to be the turning point. What had begun as suspicion among the airport staff became a full-blown confrontation between royals. The sight of Anne arriving in person underscored the seriousness of the discovery, signalling to everyone present that this was not a small misunderstanding. This was about the heart of Elizabeth's legacy, and Anne was not going to allow it to vanish unchecked on a flight to Geneva. And so the stage was set for one of the most tense and dramatic confrontations in recent royal history. Camilla stood beside her luggage, caught in a moment she surely hadn't anticipated. Anne, unwavering, demanded accountability. The trunk, sitting there with its faint crest glinting in the light, had become a symbol of secrecy, of suspicion, and of the growing rift within the royal family itself. The question now was not whether it would be opened, but what secrets it contained, and how those revelations would alter the fragile balance of trust surrounding Camilla, Charles, and the legacy of Elizabeth herself.
The moment the decision was made to open the trunk, silence fell across the private hangar at Farnborough. Security officers, aides, and members of the royal household looked on with tense anticipation. This was no longer just about luggage. It was about uncovering the truth behind an object that bore the unmistakable seal of the late Queen Elizabeth II. The air was thick with the kind of stillness that only accompanies a moment everyone knows will change things forever. What lay inside could either clear Camilla's name or confirm the darkest suspicions swirling around her departure. And when the lid creaked open, it revealed secrets far heavier than anyone expected. Under the watchful eye of officials and the unyielding presence of Princess Anne, the trunk was slowly unlocked and pried open. The sight inside was enough to steal the breath of those gathered. Among neatly wrapped parcels and bundles of papers lay Elizabeth's long-missing sapphire cross, an iconic jewel last photographed on her in 1958. Its deep blue stone glistened faintly under the hangar lights, a relic of personal history that had been whispered about for years, rumoured lost to time. But there it was, resting silently in the very trunk Camilla had been carrying out of the country. Yet that wasn't all. Alongside the sapphire cross were stacks of envelopes and bound letters, their yellowed paper and careful handwriting unmistakably belonging to Elizabeth herself. These were not public speeches, not drafts of official correspondence, but intimate private writings, letters meant for her closest confidants, notes she had never intended to be seen by the world. The combination of jewel and letters transformed the trunk into something far more than misplaced luggage. It became proof of concealment, proof that precious artifacts from Elizabeth's personal life had somehow slipped from the vaults into the hands of someone attempting to move them abroad. Gasps spread through the gathered witnesses. Even hardened security officers, trained to remain impassive, could not help but exchange uneasy glances. Princess Anne's face, witnesses later said, hardened instantly. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her very presence communicated the weight of the moment. For Anne, this wasn't just about a piece of jewelry or private letters, it was about protecting her mother's legacy. In her mind, these were sacred items, part of the heritage that should never leave the royal family's care. The fact they had been discovered in such suspicious circumstances only made the betrayal feel deeper. Camilla, confronted directly with the discovery, maintained that she had no knowledge of the trunk's contents. She insisted that her staff had packed her luggage and that she herself had not been aware of what had been placed inside. But her words rang hollow against the undeniable evidence lying open before everyone's eyes. A royal crest. A long-lost jewel. Private letters. These were not items that could be mistaken for ordinary travel possessions. To many, it seemed implausible that Camilla could have been so unaware of what she was carrying. Her denial did little to ease the storm gathering around her. The problem was not simply the objects themselves, it was the symbolism they carried. The sapphire cross was not just jewelry, it was a fragment of Elizabeth's life, imbued with decades of meaning and memory. The handwritten letters were not just paper, they were the unfiltered thoughts of a monarch whose private world had always been carefully protected. For these to appear in a trunk en route to Geneva was more than a logistical error. It suggested secrecy, perhaps even deliberate removal, and it cast a long shadow over Camilla's credibility. Anne did not hesitate. She made it unequivocally clear that the trunk would not leave the country, that its contents would be secured immediately, and that a full accounting would be demanded at Clarence House. Her authority in that moment was absolute, and those present later described it as a defining display of her loyalty to Elizabeth's memory. Where others hesitated and acted, drawing a firm line between what could be forgiven as oversight and what could not. The inspection also raised troubling new questions. If these items had been hidden in Camilla's luggage, what else might still be unaccounted for? Were there other trunks, other containers, perhaps already moved quietly out of sight? The discovery of one missing jewel and a series of letters hinted at a far larger issue, one that might stretch beyond a single suitcase and a single flight. It forced everyone present to ask themselves what had been lost, what had been hidden, and who had known about it. From that moment on, the scandal could no longer be contained. The revelation inside the trunk was not something that could be brushed aside or explained away with a few carefully chosen words. It was evidence, visible, tangible, undeniable evidence, that items tied directly to Elizabeth had ended up in Camilla's possession without transparency. And as the images and descriptions of the contents began to leak into the press, the story took on a life of its own. The world now knew about the sapphire cross. The world now knew about the letters. And the world now questioned why these treasures were discovered under such extraordinary circumstances. For Camilla, the situation spiraled into disaster. Her insistence on ignorance sounded less like a defense and more like evasion. To the public, it suggested either negligence or complicity, neither of which played in her favor. The damage to her credibility was instant, amplified by the sight of and standing so firmly against her in defense of Elizabeth's legacy. This wasn't just about an airport stop anymore. This was about loyalty, about who could be trusted to protect what Elizabeth had left behind, and about which members of the family were seen as stewards of her memory versus those accused of diminishing it. The tension in that hangar would carry over into Clarence House, where the confrontation deepened, but even before that meeting took place, the lines had been drawn. The inspection of the trunk had transformed a suspicious stop into a full-blown crisis. The contents confirmed the fears. The denials fell flat. And for Camilla, whose reputation had always walked a precarious line in the eyes of the public, the consequences of that inspection would linger far longer than the flight she never boarded. The discovery at Farnborough could not be left unresolved on a cold hangar floor. Within hours, the scene shifted from the airport to Clarence House, where the weight of what had just been uncovered demanded immediate answers. Behind the gilded doors, a tense gathering unfolded that would pit family against family in a confrontation as raw and unfiltered as any in recent memory. What should have been a private discussion about protocol and heritage quickly evolved into a battle of trust, loyalty, and legacy. With Camilla at the center of the storm, and standing as her mother's unflinching defender, William demanding accountability, and Charles trapped between his duty as monarch and his devotion as a husband. The meeting began under an atmosphere so heavy it felt suffocating. Camilla arrived first, pale but composed, her denial still the line she intended to hold. Charles was already there, visibly weary, bracing himself for the fallout that he knew was inevitable, and entered with the same air of determination she had shown at the airport, her presence as sharp as a blade. And when William arrived, his expression told everyone in the room exactly where he stood, firmly with Anne, and unwavering in his demand for clarity. Catherine, though present in spirit through William's resolve, was quietly dignified in her absence from the confrontation itself, allowing the others to clash directly without her voice altering the delicate balance of the room. William wasted no time. His words were clipped, pointed, and impossible to soften. He asked, directly and without hesitation, how Elizabeth's missing sapphire cross and private letters had ended up in Camilla's luggage, destined for Geneva. He asked who had packed the trunk, why it bore Elizabeth's crest, and why the manifest had been deliberately vague. These were not rhetorical questions. They were accusations dressed as inquiries. His tone carried the weight of a son protecting his grandmother's memory, and his anger simmered beneath each syllable. Camilla maintained her position. She had no knowledge, no involvement, no reason to believe the trunk carried anything unusual. But her words faltered under the scrutiny of Anne's gaze. Anne, whose devotion to Elizabeth had been lifelong and absolute, was not moved by excuses. She reminded everyone in the room that items bearing Elizabeth's seal were not trinkets to be misplaced. They were heirlooms, artifacts of legacy, each one carefully documented, protected, and preserved. For them to appear in Camilla's luggage was, in Anne's eyes, not a mistake but a betrayal, whether by intent or negligence. Charles, caught between the fury of his sister and son on one side and the embattled denial of his wife on the other, tried to mediate. His voice wavered as he urged caution, asking that no judgments be passed until a thorough inquiry was completed. But his attempts to temper the discussion only seemed to fuel the fire. To William and Anne, delay meant obfuscation. To Camilla, Charles's hesitation signaled that even he was questioning her. The once united family circle fractured openly in that room, each word spoken driving deeper cracks into the foundation of trust. Anne's rebuke was perhaps the sharpest moment of the confrontation. She did not raise her voice, but her words struck like iron. She declared that Elizabeth's memory was sacred, that no one had the right to remove what belonged to her legacy without the consent of the crown, and that the attempt to carry the trunk abroad had already damaged public confidence in the family's stewardship of history. Her stance was immovable, her authority bolstered by the fact that public opinion already favored her as the vigilant guardian of her mother's treasures. William, standing firmly beside Anne, added the voice of the future to her defense of the past. He warned that credibility was fragile, that once lost it could not be easily regained, and that the public would not forgive secrecy in matters tied so closely to Elizabeth. He did not need to shout. The weight of his title, his popularity, and his evident anger carried more force than volume ever could. For Camilla, each word was another nail driven into the coffin of public trust. The clash was not only emotional but symbolic. Each figure in that room represented something larger than themselves, and represented tradition, duty, and unyielding loyalty to Elizabeth. William represented the future, a generational bridge between the memory of the Queen and the expectations of a modern monarchy. Charles represented a fragile balance, a man pulled between his role as sovereign and his role as husband. And Camilla, fairly or unfairly, was cast as a figure whose actions, intentional or not, had disrupted that balance and placed the family on the edge of a credibility crisis. Those present later described the meeting as icy, punctuated by long silences and sharp exchanges. Camilla's denials continued, but the more she insisted on ignorance, the less convincing she sounded. Anne and William pressed harder, leaving little room for her to retreat with dignity. Charles, visibly shaken, could only attempt to hold the room together, even as the unity of his family unraveled before him. When the confrontation finally broke, there was no resolution, only deeper divisions. The trunk and its contents were secured, but the questions remained unanswered. The credibility of Camilla's denial remained in doubt. The determination of Anne and William to protect Elizabeth's legacy was stronger than ever. And Charles, in his attempt to straddle both sides, appeared weakened, a king unable to resolve the most personal of crises within his own household. That evening, as the doors of Clarence House remained closed to the outside world, whispers leaked nonetheless. Accounts of the confrontation reached journalists, and though the palace remained silent, the public could already sense the storm brewing behind the walls. The clash between Camilla, Anne, and William was no longer just a private family matter. It was the beginning of a narrative that would spill across headlines worldwide, painting the family in the light of conflict, betrayal, and division. The confrontation at Clarence House may have ended behind closed doors, but once whispers escaped into the press, the story took on a life of its own. Within 24 hours, the world's media had seized upon every leaked detail, magnifying the scandal into a headline frenzy. The phrase most often repeated across newspapers and broadcasts was simple, sharp, and impossible to ignore, Anne versus Camilla. That framing alone was enough to ignite a media firestorm, casting the entire royal household into the harshest light imaginable. Suddenly, what had been a contained family crisis became the subject of global debate, with Camilla at the center of a storm she could not control. The media machine wasted no time painting vivid contrasts between the two women. Camilla was depicted as secretive, evasive, and suspicious, forever linked to the image of a trunk stopped at an airport. Anne, on the other hand, was elevated as the protector of Elizabeth's memory, her intervention at Farnborough framed as the decisive act of a dutiful daughter unwilling to let her mother's legacy be compromised. Photographs of Anne arriving at the airport, stern and composed, were splashed across front pages, while articles dissected every angle of Camilla's denial, often dismissing it as implausible. Television commentators drew sharp comparisons, describing the scandal not only as a breach of trust but as a battle over heritage itself. The Iron Princess became a moniker used for Anne, a reflection of her steely resolve and her refusal to yield even when confronted with her brother's wife. Social media took this narrative further, amplifying every headline with hashtags that trended for days: #AnneTheProtector, #LegacyKeeper, and #TrunkGate. Memes circulated, some portraying Anne as a knight guarding the crown's treasures, others painting Camilla as a shadowy figure sneaking away with secrets. The humor carried a sting. It revealed exactly where the tide of public opinion was flowing. Camilla's reputation, already precarious, plummeted with stunning speed. Polls conducted in the aftermath showed overwhelming support for Anne and William, with Camilla's approval sinking to some of the lowest levels of her public life. To the public, the optics were damning. A queen consort caught with a trunk bearing Elizabeth's crest, attempting to leave the country with missing treasures, and then denying responsibility in the face of undeniable evidence. Whether she was guilty of deliberate action or simply negligent no longer mattered. The perception was enough to seal her fate in the court of public opinion. Anne's image, by contrast, soared. She was cast as the embodiment of resilience, the family's moral compass, and the unwavering defender of Elizabeth's legacy. Articles praised her lifelong work ethic, her unflashy devotion, and her refusal to bend under pressure. She had stepped in when it mattered most, and that narrative struck a chord with people both at home and abroad. William, too, gained a wave of goodwill, seen as standing shoulder to shoulder with and in defending his grandmother's legacy. His stern questioning of Camilla behind closed doors became a rallying point for those who viewed him as the future face of integrity within the monarchy. Catherine's quiet absence from the public clash, while notable, worked in her favor. Without speaking a word, she was painted as a figure of grace and dignity, the steady presence behind William's resolve. She did not need to insert herself into the battle. Instead, the public admired her restraint, seeing her as embodying the poise that contrasted starkly with the chaos swirling elsewhere. The scandal's narrative gained momentum not only because of the characters involved, but because of what the trunk symbolized. It wasn't merely luggage, it became a metaphor for secrecy, hidden histories, and the fear that parts of Elizabeth's legacy might vanish without accountability. Every news segment, every op-ed, returned to the image of that antique trunk sitting in the airport hangar, its crest glowing faintly under the harsh security lights. It was no longer just a piece of wood and iron. It had become the vessel for the public's distrust, the container of all the questions the family had never answered. International press outlets amplified the storm further, framing the scandal as a fracture within the monarchy itself. They pointed to Anne's intervention as evidence of a family at odds and used the discovery of the jewel and letters as proof that even the most sacred parts of Elizabeth's life were not immune to controversy. Late-night hosts, columnists, and commentators around the world weighed in, often with biting humor that only deepened the humiliation for Camilla and Charles. What had once been a family's private reckoning was now entertainment, gossip, and scandal fodder on a global stage. And as the days passed, the fire did not fade. More polls were taken, more hashtags spread, more stories published. Each fresh wave of attention only reinforced the divide. Camilla's image tarnished, Anne's reputation burnished, William's standing strengthened, and Charles increasingly portrayed as struggling to hold his household together. The palace's silence, its refusal to offer explanations beyond vague statements, did little to calm the storm. If anything, it fed the perception of secrecy, of truths being buried just out of sight, waiting to be uncovered like more trunks locked away in shadows. For the monarchy, the firestorm was not just embarrassing, it was destabilizing. Trust is the currency of royalty, and in those weeks following the Farnborough stop, trust was in short supply. The image of unity, of seamless stewardship of Elizabeth's memory, had been shattered in plain view of the world. What remained was a battle of narratives, Camilla fighting to salvage her reputation, and standing tall as the unwavering guardian, William positioned as the heir who would one day set things right, and Charles straining to balance his private loyalty with his public duty. The scandal might have begun with a single trunk at Farnborough, but its shadow stretched far beyond that airport hangar. What lingered in the weeks and months that followed was not simply the fallout of a family confrontation or the sting of media scrutiny. It was something deeper, something symbolic. The trunk itself became a metaphor, a physical embodiment of all the doubts, secrets, and fractures hidden within the royal household. To the public, it represented more than jewels or letters. It represented the fragile line between trust and suspicion, transparency and concealment, stewardship and neglect. Every image of that antique trunk, its crest unmistakably tied to Elizabeth, carried weight. People saw not just the wood and metal, but the larger idea of inheritance, of what is passed down, what is protected, and what is quietly taken away. If one trunk could slip through unnoticed, what else might be hidden away in basements, vaults, or private storerooms? The scandal forced people to ask a question the monarchy had always hoped to avoid. Just how much of Elizabeth's legacy had been secured, and how much was still at risk of being lost, concealed, or mishandled? For Camilla, this symbolism was devastating. She had worked for years to rebuild her image, to transition from controversy into acceptance, but the trunk reduced all that effort to ash. Fair or not, her name became linked to secrecy and betrayal. Denials did little to change perception. The sight of Anne and William standing so firmly in defense of Elizabeth cast her in an opposing light, and once the public narrative solidified, there was no escaping it. For many, she would always be the figure caught at the airport with her mother-in-law's missing treasures, an image too powerful to erase. And, in contrast, was elevated beyond even her long-standing reputation as the family's hardest worker. She became the Iron Princess, not because of her duties or her decades of quiet service, but because she was seen as the one who had stepped in when it mattered most. She did not allow the trunk to leave British soil. She demanded answers when others hesitated. And in doing so, she aligned herself with Elizabeth's memory in a way that felt authentic, unshakable, and permanent. For the public, she became the guardian of her mother's legacy, a role no title could bestow but her actions had earned. William, too, gained a new layer of credibility. His anger, his insistence on accountability, and his visible defense of his grandmother's treasures reinforced the idea that he was not just an heir, but a protector of the values people associated with Elizabeth. The younger generation had often been viewed as modernizers, but in this scandal, William stood as the bridge between the past and the future, the grandson who would not let his grandmother's memory be tarnished, and the future king who would ensure such a breach of trust would not happen again. For Charles, however, the symbolism cut differently. He was seen as caught in the middle, torn between protecting his wife and defending his mother's legacy. His attempts at mediation, his reluctance to take a firm public stance, left him painted as weak in the eyes of many. While the scandal was never about his direct actions, it still reflected on him, raising doubts about whether he could hold his family, and the institution they represented, together. But beyond the personal reputations, the trunk stood as a broader symbol of distrust. It forced people to think not just about one suitcase at one airport, but about the culture of secrecy that often surrounds powerful families. What else was hidden? What else had been lost, concealed, or spirited away under vague descriptions and sealed manifests? The unanswered questions became part of the legacy of the scandal itself, ensuring it could never be neatly closed. The image of Elizabeth's sapphire cross lying in that trunk captured imaginations around the world. It was not simply a jewel, it was a story, a piece of history, a tangible reminder of the woman who had represented continuity for decades. To see it treated as luggage rather than treasure was unsettling, even offensive, to those who revered her memory. The handwritten letters, too, symbolized vulnerability. They were private thoughts never meant to be exposed, and their presence in Camilla's luggage raised the specter of a legacy being stripped bare, turned into currency rather than cherished memory. And so, the trunk became the lasting symbol of this entire saga. A container of secrets. A vessel of distrust. A reminder that even the most carefully preserved legacies can be threatened from within. It forced a reckoning not just with Camilla's role, but with the institution itself, its transparency, its stewardship, and its ability to honor the memory of its most beloved figure. As the scandal faded from the headlines, the questions it raised did not. People continued to wonder, if one trunk could contain so much, how many more might still be hidden away? And what truths might they hold, waiting in silence, sealed in wood and iron, until another sharp-eyed guard, another determined family member, or another twist of fate brought them back into the light? The scandal of the trunk at Farnborough Airport did not end with its inspection, nor did it truly conclude with the family confrontation at Clarence House. Those were pivotal moments, yes, moments that revealed secrets, ignited conflicts, and shifted the course of reputations. but the deeper impact of this saga lies in what it left behind. Long after the headlines faded, the trunk remained a metaphor in the public consciousness, a locked box of distrust, a vessel of fragile memory, and a reminder that even the most revered legacies are vulnerable to shadows. In the beginning, it might have seemed like a mistake, an item misplaced, a staff oversight, a simple error in logistics. But the discovery of Elizabeth's missing sapphire cross and her private letters transformed the event into something far more symbolic. This was not just about an object stopped at an airport. It was about trust. It was about whether those entrusted with Elizabeth's memory could be counted on to protect it. And in that sense, the scandal struck at the very heart of the monarchy's image. For Camilla, the conclusion of this story has been nothing short of catastrophic. Denial was her chosen defense. She insisted she had no knowledge of the trunk's contents, no awareness that her luggage contained items so sacred. But denials are fragile things, and once suspicion settles in, words often fall flat. The presence of the crest, the jewel, the letters, these were tangible, undeniable facts. Against them, her protests felt hollow, and her credibility crumbled. She became, fairly or unfairly, a symbol of secrecy and betrayal. The damage to her reputation cannot be measured only in polls or newspaper clippings. It lives in the public imagination, in the way people now speak of her with narrowed eyes and lowered voices. For many, she is forever tied to that trunk at Farnborough, the Queen Consort who was caught carrying away what belonged to Elizabeth. It does not matter whether she packed it herself, whether she knew what was inside, or whether it was a misunderstanding. The perception is fixed, and once a narrative like that hardens in the public's mind, it rarely fades. By contrast, Anne emerged from the scandal as a figure reborn in the public's esteem. For decades she had been respected for her work ethic, her blunt honesty, her refusal to indulge in frivolity. But Farnborough gave her something more. It gave her the mantle of protector, the Iron Princess who defended her mother's memory when others faltered. The image of Anne arriving at the airport, confronting Camilla, and demanding that the trunk remain on British soil became one of the defining snapshots of her career. It was not only about loyalty to Elizabeth, it was about embodying the values of integrity, transparency, and unyielding duty that the public longed to see reflected in the monarchy. William, too, stepped into a new role through this crisis. His confrontation at Clarence House, his refusal to accept vague answers, and his insistence on accountability cemented him in the eyes of many as the heir who would one day restore the values associated with his grandmother. For a generation that had grown up under Elizabeth, William's defense of her treasures felt deeply personal. He was not only a grandson demanding answers, he was a future monarch demonstrating what kind of leader he intended to be. His stern stance, amplified by the quiet dignity of Catherine, positioned him as both a bridge to the past and a promise of the future. Charles, however, walked away from this scandal diminished. His role as mediator placed him in an impossible position, caught between his loyalty to his wife and his responsibility to his mother's legacy. By trying to straddle both sides, he pleased no one. To the public, he appeared hesitant, indecisive, weakened. He was the sovereign who could not prevent his household from fracturing, the monarch who seemed powerless in the face of a family dispute that spilled into the world's view. While the scandal was never directly about him, it nonetheless left a mark on his reign. The image of him torn between duty and devotion became another quiet narrative thread, one that further complicated his already fragile public standing. But the trunk scandal is not only about individuals, it is about what the trunk itself came to represent. In every headline, every debate, every viral hashtag, the object stood as a symbol of secrecy. People began to wonder, if one trunk could contain so much, how many more might exist? What else might be hidden, misplaced, or quietly moved beyond the public eye? The sapphire cross and the letters were shocking enough, but it was the possibility of more, the fear of what else lay unseen, that captured imaginations and fueled distrust. That distrust was not limited to Camilla. It bled into perceptions of the monarchy itself. For years, Elizabeth had been a symbol of continuity, a figure who reassured the public simply by existing. Her presence alone was enough to suggest stability. But once her crest was seen on a trunk stopped at an airport, the illusion of seamless stewardship cracked. People began to question the guardianship of her legacy, to wonder whether the treasures of her reign were truly safe, or whether they might vanish into obscurity through negligence or secrecy. The scandal also reshaped the way people thought about legacy itself. Elizabeth's belongings were no longer just personal items or historical curiosities. They became emblems of trust, sacred artifacts that carried meaning far beyond their physical form. To mishandle them was to mishandle the memory of Elizabeth herself. To protect them was to honor her, to stand in continuity with everything she had represented. That is why Anne's intervention resonated so deeply, why William's anger struck such a chord, and why Camilla's denial rang so false. The stakes were not just material, they were emotional, cultural, even spiritual. As the dust settled, the story did not fade completely. It remained as a kind of cautionary tale, a reminder that the monarchy's strength lies not only in its ceremonies and traditions but in the trust of the people. And trust, once broken, is not easily repaired. The image of the trunk lingered in collective memory, a symbol that could not be explained away or dismissed. It haunted the palace like a ghost, reminding everyone that secrecy breeds suspicion, and suspicion erodes legitimacy. In the end, the Farnborough scandal will likely be remembered not just as a dramatic episode of discovery and confrontation, but as a turning point in the way the public views the royal family. It stripped away the veneer of unity, revealed fractures that had long been whispered about, and forced the world to confront the uncomfortable truth that even the most revered legacies can be vulnerable. The trunk was more than an object. It was a mirror, reflecting all the doubts people had about stewardship, loyalty, and transparency. And so, the conclusion is this: the trunk at Farnborough was not just stopped at an airport, it stopped an illusion. It halted the narrative of seamless continuity, of unquestioned trust, of silent stewardship. It forced questions into the light, questions that will echo long after the scandal itself fades. Questions about loyalty, questions about legacy, questions about what lies hidden, locked away, waiting to be discovered. And as long as those questions remain unanswered, the shadow of that trunk will remain, a lasting symbol of distrust and a reminder that even the most carefully preserved crowns rest on fragile foundations.